Hi, everybody. I'm Kathie Sarachild, and I have something to say. And after many years, I have a lot to say. Even when I was a little girl, because of living in the family I lived in the village, going to the Little Red Schoolhouse, where a lot of refugees from McCarthyism went, I always had a belief and an understanding that the country wasn't living up to its ideals of democracy, equality, justice for all. And I could see it happening right in my own life. There were some people who went to Mississippi. I began to think there was a genuine pecking order of people who were the most brave, people who were a little less brave, but did it anyway. I didn't quit college to go to Mississippi. A lot of African American students gave up scholarships first in their family to go join SNCC. I waited until I had graduated. But I thought it was, as I remember, talk about not living up to its ideals, the country not living up to its ideals. This is when I began to realize that it wasn't just a question of getting the word out, that it took a struggle, it took standing up, it took courage. It took getting in the wheels of the machine, as I think somebody said in the Berkeley movement, but also demonstrating. The thing I liked about the idea of the Mississippi Summer Project was sort of the in-your-face integrated teams going into the worst state in Mississippi. And I remember as when I was 13, my parents and I had driven down to Mexico. My father had saved up his vacation time, and we got into a little VW bug. And we drove down all through the South, and seeing those segregated restrooms. And, my parents weren't about to, I wanted to, not follow the rules, but my parents insisted that we follow the rules, so that this idea of just defying the rules and was something important. It was more than saying things, it was action. And actually, the Clara Lemlich example, I got kind of hung up when you first sent that question because I didn't know enough about it. I realized when I read up about her that her speech was very short. And it was basically about saying, let's stop talking. I have something to say. Let's stop saying things and let's take action and go on strike, But she dared to say that, but mainly she dared to call for a strike and meant it. And that was the action part. It was an individual feminist consciousness. I thought this was something each woman had to battle by herself. The idea of a collective movement for women is something that came out of the civil rights movement, really. I got it from that. I didn't know that much about feminist history. I hadn't realized I knew women had had a struggle for the right to vote and everything, but I didn't realize how organized and collective and massive it was, and how that had gone on, as well as the militancy, the periods when it was very militant. It wasn't always that way. It backslid over the years and everything, but at its most effective, and when it finally won, it was massive and organized and militant. And I hadn't realized that it was so much. I thought of it as something that you were an individual feminist. And as I mentioned, my mother and I fought to have the shop for girls in the public school. So we knew about, my parents even told me that there's discrimination against women and you're going to have to deal with it. But again, it was just as an individual. So I had talk about have something to say. I had something to say in our group in Mississippi about the boys sharing more of the housework. I had spoken up about that, And it was a battle, though some guys were, of course, much better than others. And one of the guys, Chris Williams, who was very good and would pitch in on the housework, when I came back down to Mississippi in the spring of '65, he had stayed on all year. He came running up to me and he said, Kathie, you'll be so glad to know, everybody's talking about women's liberation. And there was this conference in December where some people read a paper, some women read a paper. Anyway, when I heard that phrase, women's liberation, in that context in Mississippi, in the context that I already knew was a mass movement of Black people standing up and struggling collectively for their rights, I suddenly thought, women's liberation, that could be a movement. It doesn't, maybe we could have, I didn't act on it right away. It took some years of other things happening, but I remember that phrase just rang in my head, even though it's an old phrase in some way. Simone de Beauvoir had used it and everything. In that new context, I suddenly saw it as a collective struggle, the possibilities of a collective struggle. So that was very important. But I didn't yet do anything about it, but more and more people were talking about it and whatnot. And it came from that, I think. The very phrase women's liberation was used again out of the SNCC context and evoked, at least in me, and I think other people too, some other people, this idea of organizing for women's liberation. Many of the leading voices in SNCC were saying the best thing white folks can do now for the Black liberation struggle is go fight their own oppressors and show how there are many ways, there are many injustices in the United States, there are many unrepresented groups and people in the United States. It's not just Black people. And white people have to learn more and more about that. Well, of course, I already knew that, but I didn't know it exactly, how to do it. But women did come into my mind when I heard SNCC people say things like that. And then I read an article in the National Guardian about this big conference, the National Conference for, I forget the name of it. It was in the fall of 1967. It was a big conference in which Black people had demanded 50% of the vote. It was a new left conference. And I read at the very end of the article about some women had gotten up on the stage and they were demanding that women should also have 50% of the vote. And I happened to know the writer, Bill Price, of the article. I called him up immediately. I said, who are those women, And then he said, well, it so happens that one of them is starting a group in New York. That was Shulamith Firestone. And he put me in touch with her. And meanwhile, I talked to my good friend, Carol Hanisch, with whom I'd been talking about this issue and what to do about it. And we started going to New York Radical Women. It had been started. That was in late 1967. When I joined it, I was so excited. I felt so good to see all these women in the room ready to do something. There was already like an argument going on between our group and the group in Chicago about how much male chauvinism should be criticized in our action. And the New York group was very into being right out front about telling it like it is about male chauvinism. And the Chicago group wanted to be much softer about it and everything. And so what we demanded a New York speech as well as a Chicago speech, because there was already this sense that there were some political differences. And what would the New York speech say? And in discussing the various things, one person came up with a draft, and here we go again. Do you have something to say? Well, I had something to say about that draft, about what I thought was wrong with the draft and what I thought it should say. And I was chosen to give the speech from what I said. So that's how that came about. Our first action, now consciousness raising, came out of the discussion afterwards about what to do next. And this really wonderful speaker, Ann Forer, her name was, she said that I think we still have a lot to do about raising our consciousness more. And so I realized I needed my consciousness raised, even though I thought I already was, So we decided to have a program to raise our own consciousness, even though a lot of us already thought it had been, but we realized it wasn't. And so we developed this idea. There was this idea going around from the civil rights movement, really, I think it was, that people, and it came, right, not I think, it came from this fight your own oppression, that the way, that one of the rules about studying subjects about our own lives with women was that we would have to say how what we were saying applied in our own lives. We wouldn't just talk about other women like sociologists or something, that what we said had to be true of ourselves. And that was one of the rules about consciousness raising. And another rule, it wasn't really a rule because it seemed so true and right, that we would go around the room so that we would hear everybody's experience, not just to listen, to be good listeners, but to get the information from every woman and to pool it and come up with the truth. And the idea of the speak out, the abortion speak out, also came from that, because there was a movement going on in New York, it was New York State, where the Now group and the women's liberation groups were getting together to demand repeal of the abortion laws, not just reform. And using birth control, but with abortion as a backup, you could, to get a little crass, you could enjoy sex more if you didn't have to worry about getting pregnant. It affected your daily life. Anyway, so we wanted total repeal of the laws. And the theoretician of this campaign, Cindy Sisler, she argued very well. She said abortion is less dangerous than childbirth. It shouldn't. Midwives do childbirth. Why can't they do abortion? It doesn't even have to be a doctor doing abortion. So, and that was back then. Here's the other thing she said that was so important for the repeal idea. And that was, there are no medical laws. There are no laws telling doctors what to do. Why is there a law about this medical procedure? So all that was raising our consciousness about abortion. So there was this movement on to repeal the laws, and there was this legislative hearing that was going to be held to reform the report, what reforms there should be. So all the groups got together to picket this reform hearing to call for repeal instead of reform. But someone in Red Stockings, because Red Stockings had already formed then out of New York Radical Women, said, listen, this is an almost all male panel. They're all men. There were something like 12 men and a nun. Why don't we bring our consciousness raising ideas to this hearing and demand that women testify as the real experts on abortion as we call for repeal? And so we decided that we would go in, kind of interrupt the hearing and demand that we testify as the real experts on abortion about the impact that these abortion laws were having on our lives. Some of us had had abortion, some of us had given up kids for adoption, and some of us had just had pregnancy scares. But speaking from our own self-interest, we were going to address all of those issues in the hearing and demand that women be the real were the real experts on this. And that was kind of the beginning of the speak out idea, bringing consciousness raising public rather than just as an action, rather than just in this hearing. I had been chosen this time by lot to lead off this disruption of the hearing. I was afraid of getting arrested and not showing up at work the next day, but I was committed to doing it. We were committed to action, to spread the word, to get it out. And I had been chosen to lead it off. And probably because of that, the reporters all came running to me as the ringleader, I guess. I was afraid, but I also wanted to scare them, to tell you the truth, scare them into doing something. I had that. So as they were talking, now I had not had an abortion. So with me, it was a pregnancy scare thing, that I could talk about from my own experience. and how that had made me feel when I thought I was pregnant, and anyway, I sat there listening to these guys talking, and they were talking about, well, let's make it okay to have an abortion if a woman has had 4 children. I remember that one really teed me off. And that's when I got up and I said, let's hear from the real experts, And I began talking about my life a little, but I remember I'd also planned this scare them idea. I began saying, it's made me feel, it's the effect it's had on my life. It's made me feel like we need to force doctors at gunpoint to perform abortions. Now, of course, the idea of forcing doctors at gunpoint was to relieve them of the responsibility so they wouldn't be arrested at that point. It was only doctors who were being arrested for. But anyway, that appeared in one of the newspaper articles. And later, somebody wrote a book saying this was the first violent demonstration for abortion rights. So it had quite an impact, I think. It just was a few minutes of my talking, but then everybody else was jumping up and talking about the whole group, including some women who'd heard about our action, who didn't know that exactly what was going to happen there, but they came in, and that's when the news reporters started coming over to us, and the hearing was disbanded. It ended that hearing in the middle. And then 2 of the Red Stockings women, we were out in the hall. We'd all been pushed into the hall. Nobody was arrested. We were just hauled out of the hearing room, and they barred the doors and everything. Much to my relief, nobody was arrested. But 2 of the women, one of whom had had an abortion, an illegal abortion, and the other who had been unable to get an abortion and given a child up for adoption, began to testify before the TV cameras. And I was so glad about the press coverage. Friends of mine in Ireland sent me, wrote to me that there was press coverage about it in Ireland because my name was used and furthermore, how was my name used? They came and they asked me what my name was, and then they published it as Mrs. Kathie Sarachild. I never said anything about Mrs., not a thing, but it did go around the world, actually. And somebody in I forget which administration, the Johnson, a woman, a feminist mole in the Johnson administration who now, I forget her name right now, it's too bad. She's been credited in history with being a major influence on getting Now started and everything. She wrote to me and sent me clippings of what she had done. So it had gotten to Washington. The New York Times had a big coverage of it with a great shot outside the hearing of women kind of shouting at policemen who had barred the door to get back in. So it was really good coverage. One of the main purposes of the Mississippi Summer Project really was with white people going down there, was to get news coverage of what was happening to Black people and trying to register. Black people were getting killed and there was no news coverage of it. So the idea was sending white people down there. If white people got killed, there might be news coverage. And sure enough, that's just what happened, So getting news coverage was something I thought of as this big struggle. And suddenly we got news coverage fairly easily. Looking at the history, the thing that really got the abortion movement going was the women's liberation movement. There had been all these people who were just for abortion repeal or even reform as a just cause in its own right. But it was only when it was incorporated into a mass women's liberation movement, of which abortion was only one issue. I think that was a big part of generating the impact. So, and in New York State, which had the real breakthrough reform, partly, I believe, as a result of our fighting for repeal. In some ways, the reform was to head off the repeal lawsuits and everything. But I think it was also because we were in the streets marching and speaking out about our own abortions. There was even a lawsuit that modeled itself after the Speak Out, in which the women testified about their abortions, that was almost into the courts when the reform law was passed. And one thing about, although there had been a couple of other reform laws passed already, the one in New York State was the only one that allowed out-of-state women to come in. So New York became this kind of the only one inside the United States, the only place inside the United States. Before that, you had to go outside the United States. To a lot of the communist countries, you could go to get an abortion, but that was so expensive. You had to have a lot of money to go to a communist country to get abortion, you know. So, and in Puerto Rico, it was easier to get abortions, but it was still illegal. You know, there were still the dangers of that. Who knew what you're going to get? We're way ahead of that now. It's much better than that. I mean, not only a kind of a proof of that was that when that horrible Hyde Amendment came in 1977, taking the right, allowing states to deny women on Medicaid abortion, New York didn't follow that, and some other states didn't follow that. In New York, women could continue to have their abortions paid for through Medicaid. Of course, that was only that's a very populous state, but so we're way ahead of where we were before Roe v. Wade, which nationally said states could not outlaw abortions. The Supreme Court would have to rule, to go back to where we were, the Supreme Court would have to rule that it's illegal nationally for women to have abortions. And that would be something very different. I mean, it's not impossible. I mean, if we get fascism here or something, it's not impossible. But so we're already way ahead. Furthermore, there's now pill abortions. I think it's still a big problem. I think that we should really fight for the big problem. One of the big problems, we have to fight for, I believe we have to fight for abortion as healthcare. That's very good to frame it like that. And we need national health insurance that covers birth control of all kinds. That's another thing that Cindy Sisler, the theoretician of this struggle from the 60s, would hammer at, that we should really use the term birth control for both abortion and contraception. There are two forms of birth control. And then there's a really good book. By the way, you talk about the pill, but a lot of us were against the pill, actually. There are other things besides the pill that are quite good. The diaphragm, the condom, which protects against sexually transmitted diseases much more than other things. And actually, there's a great book about this called Reproductive Rights and Wrongs, which points out that the barrier methods of diaphragms and condoms combined with abortion as a backup when those go wrong, which is not that often, is actually a lot healthier for the female body than pills or IUDs. But the reason people aren't promoting that is all the anti-abortion stuff. If abortion was freely there as a backup, women would use much healthier, and men would use healthier forms of birth control. I don't want to, turn people away from the pill or anything, but it is something to consider, so that we really need abortion for health, for better contraception. We need abortion for better contraceptive. And anyway, it's an important fight. I think we have to revive the women's liberation movement to have a strong and winning strategy for abortion. And we also have to combine it with national health care, which even really the grassroots of the right wing, they really national health care really does appeal to them. My husband was on a clinic defense thing in Gainesville, Florida, where he was helping women to go into the clinic past the picketers who were calling the women murderers for having abortion. Well, he got into a discussion with the right-wing picketers about national health care, and they were for national health care. You know, in Red Stockings right now, we're trying to emphasize raising consciousness about the United States being behind. It's behind in so many things. There's this idea, you know, including about the kinds of things that will be good springboards to women's liberation, like childcare, parental leave, a shorter work week. People don't realize that in other countries are way ahead of the United States even on the shorter work week, not to mention national health care. So we're trying to raise consciousness about how other countries have it better, contrary to the myth that America has it the best. We call it the myth of America. And that's one strategy that we're employing, that these things are not just issues in their own right, but they're springboards for women's liberation. What we're trying to figure out in Red Stockings is how to build organizations that can persist. Because what we have had again and again is we have these uprisings, these women's liberation uprisings. That's what happened in 69 through 73. We got lots of media attention. Everybody was talking about women's liberation. With the Me Too movement, there's kind of been a Me Too uprising, which wasn't as tied to organizing, but even that women's liberation uprising, which was tied to the idea of building organizations, still we didn't succeed in building organizations that can persist. How to both expand and persist is a really tough question. You know, the problem is, one problem with the organizing, learning how to organize and organizations that persist, I'll give Frederick Engels credit for this. Some article he wrote about the British labor movement I was reading. He pointed out that people say, you know, there are all these famous quotes like from Shelley the poet, "We are many, they are few, and therefore if we only knew our power, we could unite." But as Engels pointed out, actually, that's true, but it's a lot harder for the many to unite than for the few. Forget the fact that the few have all the money. It's also just harder for many, many people to unite. You know, I don't think the women's liberation movement would have been possible without the gains won by the previous generation. We were able to go on to women's liberation because of the gains of the labor movement. And now we've lost those gains of the labor movement. I feel like one of my lessons of all of this, how much the freedom struggle, all of our freedom struggles and the one big freedom struggle is a learning process. As soon as we began to have the experience from trying to make changes and see what succeeded and what didn't succeed, and having things taken away, as well as these amazing, surprising successes that we didn't think would happen so fast, I suddenly began to read about what had happened and wanted to read about what happened in the past with a new intensity to get ideas to deal with these good and bad things that had happened. So I do think, and another thing about the freedom struggle being a learning process, another aspect of this, I think a lot of us had the wrong idea in the beginning of the movement, that revolution was total change. And therefore, all the revolutions out in the world were failures because they hadn't achieved full freedom. Even with women's liberation, we castigated the Soviet Union rather than appreciating what they had been able to achieve for women way ahead of some of the things we had achieved. We all could only see what they hadn't achieved for women, you know. And that was all part of this idea that revolution was either total greatness, or it wasn't a revolution, or it had failed. And it was only in the course of reading some of these things and learning from experience that I began to see that this is actually in the revolutionary classics, that revolution was seen as a leap, not as a leap forward, not total perfection, and that people would learn from leaps. There are steps, strides, and leaps. You're lucky if you have a leap. That the history shouldn't be telling you must do it this way because it was done in the past. But we draw ideas. It's up to us to get from the history, draw ideas for where to go and what ideas for what to do. Action ideas, simple action ideas, or strategy ideas. Thank you. I have something to say, but thank you for giving me this chance to say it and to say it to new generations.